Breaking news tonight. Thousands of families across the United States are finally seeing motion in petitions once considered frozen. For years, petitioners refreshed case trackers in silence, waiting for that single update that could reunite them with loved ones. But verified information from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services suggests change is underway. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to Immigration Updates, tap the like button, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss developments that may affect your family's future. As we step into November 2025, subtle yet meaningful adjustments are reshaping America's immigration landscape. Behind closed office doors, USCIS has begun accelerating parts of the I-130 petition pipeline, the document that lets U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents bring immediate relatives to live with them in the state. It's long been an unpredictable path, sometimes stretching from months into years. Families have described it as waiting in the dark, watching calendar pages flip with no sign of progress. But now, fresh internal data from late October through early November 2025 shows movement that's impossible to ignore. According to USCIS Self-Center statistics, I-130 petitions for immediate relatives, spouses, parents, and unmarried children under 21 are being finalized in roughly 13 to 15 months on average. That's a clear improvement from last year's, 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 improvement from last year's 18-month 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 wait. It may not sound revolutionary, but for families living apart, it's the first real exhale in a long time. Immigration attorneys and advocacy networks attribute this improvement to a strategic redistribution of workloads within USCIS. Officers from divisions with lighter caseloads were temporarily reassigned to help process family petitions, clearing bottlenecks that piled up during the pandemic and shifting policy transitions. In particular, the Potomac and Nebraska service centers, once notorious for their heavy backlogs, are reporting faster completions. While not every field office is matching that pace, visible progress across multiple centers marks one of the most promising phases for family-based immigration since 2020. If you filed your I-130 earlier this year, this is encouraging. Many applicants are already noticing quicker movement inside their USCIS online portals. Receipt notices and case status updates that used to appear after a month are now showing within just 2 weeks. That might seem like a small shift, but to families divided by borders, a receipt notice isn't just paper. It's proof of motion. It's hope and official ink. Still, progress at UC's tells only half the story. Once an I-130 petition clears approval, attention turns to the next chapter, the National Visa Center, where paperwork meets preparation for overseas interviews. Once an I-130 petition is approved, the next stage begins at the National Visa Center, or NVC. For families with relatives living abroad, this is where the process moves from approval to preparation. The NVC collects documents, pre-processes cases, and schedules visa interviews at U.S. consulates around the world. Right now, the wait times at the NVC remain challenging. Depending on the region, processing can still stretch from 3 to 6 months between case approval and the scheduling of an interview. Consulates in Manila, Ciudad Juarez, and Mumbai continue to face higher workloads, though several of them have recently expanded interview capacity ahead of the new fiscal year. As of November, multiple consulates have added extra interview slots, a move that could help clear backlogs by early 2026. Officials are hopeful this expansion will allow more families to receive interview letters before the end of January. This update is especially promising for those under the F2A category, which includes spouses and unmarried children of lawful permanent residents. For much of 2024 and early 2025, this group experienced near stagnation. But in recent months, the visa bulletin has started moving again, advancing by roughly 1 to 2 months per update. The progress may seem modest, but after a year of limited movement, it's a sign of hope for thousands of waiting families. Within the federal system, these improvements are being closely monitored. Under the current administration's renewed focus on efficiency with oversight, USCIS has been directed to increase productivity while maintaining strong vetting standards. This means officers are being urged to process legitimate petitions faster, but also to examine questionable ones more carefully. It's a balance of speed with caution. Applicants are reminded that accuracy matters more than ever. A missing document, mismatched date, or unclear proof of relationship can still trigger a request for evidence, or even a denial, adding months to the wait. So while the system is improving, experts urge applicants to double-check every submission. Review your financial affidavits, birth certificates, and supporting evidence carefully. A well-organized petition can mean the difference between months of delay and an early approval. Meanwhile, cooperation between USCIS and the U.S. Department of State has strengthened this quarter. Both agencies are working together to align the allocation of family-based visa numbers, aiming to prevent retrogression, the dreaded step backward that sometimes sends applicants back in line. If this coordination continues, applicants could see a more predictable and stable visa bulletin throughout early 2026, avoiding the abrupt slowdowns that have caused heartbreak for families so close to reunion. Now let's talk about what to expect in the coming months. If you filed your I-130 petition between late 2024 and mid-2025, you may begin seeing faster communication and progress on your case through the first quarter of 2026. Immediate relative categories are currently benefiting the most, while extended family preference categories, such as F3 for married children and F4 for siblings, remain heavily backlogged. Unfortunately, those categories still face wait times that can stretch beyond 10 years, depending on the applicant's country of chargeability. Despite repeated calls for reform, no major legislative breakthrough has yet been passed in Congress to shorten those queues. Bills like the proposed HER Act and similar immigration modernization proposals are still under discussion, but have not yet become law. Still, the recent progress brings renewed optimism. Every approval represents more than just a case number. It's a story of patience, endurance, and family. A husband finally able to reunite with his wife. A parent embracing their child after years apart. A grandparent witnessing milestones once thought lost to time. And while political debates about border enforcement and reform continue in Washington, these quiet victories remind us that America's immigration system, though complex and often slow, is still moving forward, one petition at a time. For families still waiting, awareness remains your most powerful tool. Regularly check your USCIS online account and the State Department's Visa Bulletin. Make sure your contact information is updated and prepare supporting documents in advance in case you receive a request for evidence or interview notification. Progress often favors those who stay proactive. As the new year approaches, USCIS officials suggest additional efficiency measures could be announced, possibly expanding electronic filing options and improving digital communication between service centers and the NVC. These improvements aim to reduce paperwork delays and make it easier for applicants to track their cases in real time. So while the challenges aren't over, there is measurable progress. Families separated by bureaucracy are slowly finding their way back together, and the numbers prove that hope is justified. Before we close, here's a quick recap of what's changing right now. I-130 processing times for immediate relatives have dropped to around 13 to 15 months. Receipt notices are arriving faster, often within 2 weeks. USCIS has redistributed workloads to clear backlogs in family petitions. NVC interview scheduling delays continue, but are improving as consulates expand capacity. The F2A category is advancing again after months of stagnation. Coordination between USCIS and the State Department is helping stabilize visa bulletin movement. Preference categories like F3 and F4 remain delayed, with no new congressional relief yet. Each small improvement matters because behind every case is a real family waiting, hoping, and believing in the American promise of reunion. If you're one of those families, stay informed, stay organized, and don't lose hope. This is Immigration Updates, where verified facts meet clarity. We remain committed to transparency, accuracy, and trusted reporting so you can make decisions with confidence. If you found this report helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Immigration Updates, and share it so more families can stay informed. Your support helps us continue bringing verified coverage on U.S. immigration policy every day. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next update. Right here on Immigration Updates, where every fact matters and every update counts.